welcome everyone to this evening's basic income conversation. And tonight is going to be a conversation with Michael Tubbs. I'm Michael Pugh, so there's two Michaels to get your head around this evening. And I'm the director and co-founder of the Basic Income Conversation. And I'm your host this evening. I'm not sure, but well, obviously tonight is the night that pubs and restaurants are reopening. And for any audience members who are not from the UK, that those have been shut for the best part of the last 4 months. So particularly grateful for everyone who's resisted the urge to go out this evening and join us for the next hour of conversation about basic income. And a very warm welcome to those of you who are on YouTube, who are watching this back. That does mean for everybody else that we are recording this evening's event, so people can watch this back afterwards, particularly those who are down the pub or restaurant this evening. For those of you who are new to the Basic Income Conversation, we blend community organising, advocacy and research to promote a basic income in the UK. We're hosted by the think tank Compass, and we exist really to support people and organisations to explore the potential impact of basic income and turn that idea into reality. And we do that through conversations, hence our name, hence events like this evening. And we're really excited this evening to be joined by someone who has done exactly that, turned basic income from an idea into reality in his home city of Stockton. Our guest this evening is going to be Michael Tubbs, the former Mayor of Stockton, the founder of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, and the current economic advisor to the Governor of California. That's where Michael's stuck in a meeting at the moment, and so he'll be joining us shortly. He's got a very tight schedule. That was partly why tonight's timings of the event had to move. So we're very grateful for Michael joining us shortly, and hopefully it won't be too long until we can hear from him. We're going to be hearing all about Michael's pioneering leadership of the Stockton Demonstration, which piloted a basic income from 2019 to 2021, and how that pilot is now spreading to dozens of cities across the United States and the wider world, thanks to his work of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. Lots of you will be watching this evening have already basic income advocates here in the UK. And we're going to be really getting Michael's insight and advice on how best we can frame basic income and how it plays out on the doorstep. And really, tonight's about learning about what's going on in the US and how we can maximise that learning for us here in the UK. And to help us translate that from the US to a UK context, I'm also joined by two special guests who are at the heart of the efforts on the ground of advocating for a basic income in the UK. We've got Tchiyiwe Chihana from the UBI Lab Network and John Alexander from a whole bunch of organisations, perhaps most relevant for us tonight, Lib Dems for a Basic Income. Do you want to both give us a wave? Hi, both of you. They'll be asking Michael some questions themselves and sharing their own insights into kind of how this works, how what we're hearing makes sense for a UK audience, and hopefully they won't get too confused about having to speak to two Michaels. We've only got an hour this evening, so we're going to be going up to about 8 o'clock UK time. We've got a lot to discuss. We're not going to be taking questions in a traditional Q&A format for that reason. But thanks to those of you who have submitted questions beforehand, we're going to try and get to some of those and try and weave those into the questions that we'll hear. But we do really want people to participate tonight using the chat box. So leave your comments and reactions in there as we go. Perhaps to start with, could everybody introduce yourselves if you haven't already? It's good to see some people already doing this, by putting your name and where you are calling in from this evening. And my colleague Cleo is on call tonight. Cleo, do you want to quickly give us a wave as well, helping to keep the chat going and keep that nice and lively. So people like Hugh, people like Nicola there, do put do put it in panelists and attendees so that everybody can see who's coming in. Don't just send it to panelists, otherwise it's only myself, Tchiyiwe, John, and Pugh that can see that. So do send that to everybody, which is fantastic. Look at that, lots of people joining in from all over the place. So I suppose before we get into, obviously Michael's still waiting to join us. I wanted to first go to both Tchiyiwe and John just to get a sense of who you are in this basic income space, and why you're particularly interested in what's happening in the United States and in Stockton in particular. So can I go to Tchiyiwe first? Do you want to quickly introduce yourself and why you're interested in what we're going to hear tonight?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks, Basic Income Conversation. My name is Tchiyiwe Chihana, and I work for an organization called All Person Independence. And within that, we've got a strand that works specifically on universal basic income. That's the UBI Lab network. We have groups within the UBI Lab network that are grassroots led, but then they've got researchers, they've got activists and advocates from all angles. And my particular work revolves depending on the current niche of what we're working on. So presently, I'm working on the cross-party parliamentary and local government group that we work in partnership with Basic Income Conversation on, and also some of the international networking for UBI Lab network.
Thanks so much, Tchiyiwe. And John, do you want to do likewise?
Yeah, sure. So I'm John Alexander. I realise I am not the attraction this evening, but he will be here very soon. I'm sure. This is the hazard of getting a big name for these things. My work, I run an organisation called the New Citizenship Project as my day job, where we work with all sorts of organisations of all shapes and sizes. Michael is arriving. I'm going to be quiet because he's the you want to hear. So I'm going to hand back, and I'll probably feature a little bit later on. Back to you, Mike.
Sure, thanks, John, and very warm welcome to Michael Tubbs, who's just joining us and getting his audio sorted. Thank you so much for being here. We've been holding the fort whilst you've been in meetings.
No, I had a problem with Zoom. I'm like the least tech savvy person. I don't have staff anymore, so it's just me. So forgive me, but I'm happy to be here.
Okay. Well, great to have you here. We've been doing a little bit of an intro. We know we've only got you until until just on the hour mark, so another 50 minutes or so. So precious time with you in our evening over here. We were just saying at the beginning, Michael, it's quite a special day here in the UK. We've had our pubs and restaurants shut for the best part of 4 months. So tonight's the first night things are opening up. So we're competing, I think, with other distractions for folks here tonight, but so we're super grateful for you being here. We're gonna go over obviously start with Stockton. We're going to talk a little bit about the demonstration, what went on there, how that's spreading now across the United States, and really unpack like what does that mean for us here in the UK? What kind of lessons can we extract from you and kind of take some inspiration? And then we're going to particularly think about as well like the kind of narratives and the framing, which we've taken a lot from your work, and how that translates at elections as well. So lots to get through. You'll see people introducing themselves on the chat box as we go, but it'd be great if you could introduce yourself a little bit, Michael, and perhaps perhaps start in Stockton, because so much of the story, your story and the basic income story, focuses around that. I was lucky enough to visit there in the summer of 2019, and I remember getting off the Amtrak train, coming out the station, and thinking this is a very different place to San Francisco where you get on the train. And I was thinking, is this the right place? It's a bit of a walk into the city, and it's very hot days. Take us to Stockton. Describe a little bit about how your relationship to the city.
Well, first, and I'm not as exciting as beer gardens and pubs, but I'm actually free to 12:30 if we have to go longer. If not, I'm happy to shut up earlier, but I don't want you to feel rushed or anything. Well, first, hello. So good to see you all on Zoom and everyone in the chat. My wife actually just completed her PhD from Cambridge, so she's clever. I think that's what you guys call smart people over there. So she has a little bit of couple of edits to do, but she'll be a doctor in this summer. And I went to Mayball 2 years ago actually, and it was a lot of fun. So I know that's not all of the UK, but that's sort of my small connection to the place. But I'm born and raised in Stockton, California. Stockton, California is my home. I was born 30 years ago to a mother who was a teenager. She was in high school when I was born. My father was a high schooler as well, but he was in a juvenile detention facility by the time I was born. And he's been incarcerated for the majority of the 30 years I've been, like 28 of the 30 years or 27 of the 30 years that I've been alive. And I start there because I think for me, the conversation about a basic income or a guaranteed income or universal basic income is one that's deeply rooted in personal experience, and that all these tropes we have, I'm sure it's the same across the pond as it is here. Like all the tropes we have about why people struggle, about why people don't have enough money. I just did not see growing up, and I grew up with poor people. Like my family, our friends, like everyone struggled a little bit. And I didn't see people who were lazy. I saw people who were literally working themselves to death, who wouldn't go to the doctors, and you guys are lucky you guys have healthcare, like who wouldn't go to the doctors because they couldn't afford it, who never took a day off. Like I remember feeling so weird when I became an adult and folks were saying you need to take a mental health day. And not because mental health days aren't important. I was like, a mental health day? What is that? And they're like, you're feeling stressed. I'm like, my mom could use a hell of a lot of mental health days. Like how come it's only afforded to people with fancy degrees and good jobs, right? Like so that I never saw my mom take a vacation. I heard like she never took like a week off to go on the boat or a week off to like go like hike. Like she just I never saw her do anything to be human. I saw her work and be mom, and sleep. And I remember growing up and feeling I was like, there has to be more, and this has not be right. And I was like, it's not because my mom's dumb. My mom was very smart. She just wasn't able to go to college because she had to raise me, right? Like, and then Stockton as a place is super interesting. It's in the Central Valley of California, so it's about an hour and a half away from San Francisco, an hour away from Sacramento. This is the most diverse city in the United States. So the entire world is in Stockton. But I'll pause by saying diversity doesn't mean inclusion or acceptance. Like there's a bunch of diversity in the city, but the city still has a problem with white supremacy and racism. There's a bunch of, because it's not just white people who have issues with white supremacy. It's like a shared phenomenon. Anyway, the city is very hard scrabble, working class. The median income in the city for a household is $46,000. And that's for a household, like 2 people, 1 people, etc. And a third of our kids live in poverty, 22% poverty rate, but incredibly resilient people. 60% of the city is foreign born or their parents are foreign born. So really a global city in the Central Valley. And it's like the most, and you saw when you came, it's the most interesting. At some places, sometimes you think you're like in like Newark, New Jersey, and then sometimes you think you're like in a cow town. And so it's just really, really interesting. And it's the honor of my life to govern there for 8 years. And Stockton historically has had many challenges. So in 2012, we were the largest city to declare bankruptcy. We once had more murders per capita than Chicago, which kind of in America is the barometer for like gun violence. So I was able to graduate from high school. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to Stanford, did that for 4 years. Decided to run for city council during my senior year in college at 21, won that, represented my neighborhood. And then 4 years after that, I became mayor. And feel free to cut me off. I'm probably answering more than your question.
No, this is great. This is great. I'm in my next cut you off moment was going to be like, well, how did basic income like come on your agenda? Like when did you, had you heard about this before you became mayor? How did that come on your radar?
So my sophomore year in college, or freshman year, I took a class on Dr. King, taught by Claiborne Carson, who's like he runs the King's Papers Project, one of the leading experts on Dr. King. And I read Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And it was Dr. King's last book, written right before he was assassinated. And I remember reading it, and there was part of it that talked about a guaranteed income. And what was shocking to me is that growing up in church, every Dr. King day, I had to give a Dr. King speech. had to play Dr. King and play. Like I spent a lot of time, at least in January, doing Dr. King type things. And I had recited many of his speeches, gave reenactments of them, had never heard Dr. King and guaranteed income. So I remember reading it, and I was like, and it was written right before he was assassinated. So, 19, 20 years old, everything's a conspiracy. So I'm like, oh, this must be why. But this is part of the reason why he's assassinated. But as a 19-year-old, I'm like, oh my gosh, he was calling for this, and then he's assassinated. So I was always very interested. And I said, it will be interesting one day to be part of a conversation in the United States about sort of the Poor People's Campaign, which is what he was leading before he was assassinated, and about this idea. Does it work? Does it not work? But I had no idea there was a bunch of thinking that underpinned his work and a bunch of thinking after his work. I just remember reading that and saying, Dr. King called for a guaranteed income, and we don't talk about that on Dr. King's Day. That seems suspicious to me. What he said, and what resonated with me was not that he said it, but it's what he said. And he said, and this is after like decade of work on civil rights, on housing, on segregation, et cetera. And he said, we try to solve poverty. He talked about how existing efforts to solve for poverty are all pygmy and piecemeal. That's what he said. And then he said, we try to solve for poverty by solving for housing. And he said, well, yes, housing is an important issue, and we should solve for housing, but solve for housing to solve for housing. Don't solve for housing to solve for poverty. Then he said, we also say education. And he said, yes, education is important. And we should solve for education with education, but we shouldn't solve for education to solve poverty. And he said that on and on. He said, but I'm now convinced the simplest way to abolish poverty is the most direct. A guaranteed income pegged at the national median income and keeping up with inflation, with the argument being that no one should, like, it's not good for anyone to live in poverty, much less even folks who don't live in poverty. So when I became mayor, I realized that all the issues we talked about in Stockton, crime, homelessness, et cetera, were issues, but in my opinion, the root of the issue is poverty and economic scarcity. So I told my team, we're gonna do all the mayor stuff, potholes, trees, ribbon cuttings, dog parks, public comment during meetings, all that stuff. I said, but in addition to that, I really want to use our 4 years to really figure out what can a city do to address the issue of poverty, particularly because we know in Stockton that Black families have 2 times less the median income of white families. And that's not because Black families work 2 times less as hard. Like, this is not the case. So they came back with these ideas, and they talked about guaranteed income and give directly in Kenya and stuff happening in Ontario. It was interesting at first when they told me that, because I remember the Dr. King thing, but I was like, $3 and that's not going to really help. So I don't know how that's going to help here. And then I was like, well, then I thought about some more. I was like, oh, don't be dumb. Like, you could increase the value of it. You could increase the value of the payment. The issue is that you can get payments. Like, that's the model. Mm-hmm. And once I figured that, once I came to myself around that, like, oh yeah, we could do more than $3 because it might need to be more than $3. We do 500, 1,000, etc. So that's sort of how we came to it. And then I met Natalie Foster from the Economic Security Project, which is like one of the leading, probably the leading organization in the United States around cash transfer guaranteed income. And they talked about they were looking for a city to pilot guaranteed income in. And I told her I had a task force, just my team writing, but I had a task force looking at the issue, and we were ready to go. And that's the long and short story of how we got the guaranteed income pilot in Stockton.
That's great. So obviously, you can't take, the key issue was payments. You got to the number, which ended up being $500 a month. Do you want to just quickly, for those that don't know and haven't had a read about it, just a sense of what exactly was the demonstration in terms of, how many people, how much was it, how long did it last, how was it funded? Just if you could just rattle through that would be great.
Yeah. And before I rattle, I want to say what was been very interesting to me, and for all the activists, advocates, politicians, whoever's listening, is that it seemed so small. It was big, but now in the context of 4 years later, with all these pilots and the global conversations, it seems so small. But that goes to show you that you can't despise small beginnings, and sometimes being catalytic is difficult, it's scary, but it reaps such dividends that a couple years later, you'll be like, that's it? Like, why didn't we do more? So, and
Yeah, and
Stockton,
just to pick you up on that, I mean, like we have that conversation a lot in the UK. There's been various kind of models that come out there. The kind of consensus that is emerging is that perhaps initially a modest basic income of even somewhere between like 50 and 150 pounds a week, which again doesn't sound like much at all. But like I was thinking the same thing, is that surely that doesn't make a difference, but it does. And like, you know, you see the potential impacts in terms of the sheer scale of the impacts on poverty. It sounds like that was a kind of similar thing that was running through your mind.
Yeah. So we did 125 families, randomly selected, and the only criterion, because we wanted it to be as universal as possible, but with $1 million, you can't. What are you gonna do? Give everyone $3? Like we had to like target it in some way. So what we decided to do was let's make it as inclusive as possible. So we made the criterion you had to live in a zip code where the average of that zip code was at or below the city's median, and that made 76% of the city eligible. And we're like, okay, it's not 100%, but that's 76% of the people in the city could get it. That's very close to universal. And we gave folks $500 a month through a debit card for 18 months. And then because of COVID-19, a great donor named Carol Tolan extended it to 24 months. And we every month for 2 years via debit card, folks were given $500.
And so you mentioned COVID there, obviously slightly extending it and somewhat, I guess, changing some of the stories that would have taken place. But could you outline some of those findings that we found? Obviously, we had, was it last month, some of the initial results came out, quite stark. And can you just kind of run through some of the results that came out from that study?
Well, I don't know if you guys have the same sort of conversation in the UK, but in the States, so much of the vitriol I received once we started was that I single-handedly was going to get people to stop working. That people would get $500 and they'll never want to work again. First of all, you see how people are during COVID. People don't like staying at home. People want to be out of their house. People want to be with people. People want to be productive, and people want to be doing things. And what we found is that those who received the guaranteed income compared to those who didn't were actually 2 times more likely to find full-time work, to transition from part-time jobs to full-time jobs, and also 2 times less likely to be unemployed. So like this idea that something as small as $500 was enough of a bridge to allow people to have more agency and leave exploitative job or leave jobs they weren't happy in, and to take risk on themselves and interview for other jobs. Super powerful finding. The second finding was that
I was just going to intersect there. Like, I mean, we often hear like things from pilots and experiments where we hear, you know, it's mental health and well-being. You know, every single time you hear that as a finding and an impact and its improvement. But it feels like the thing that came out of Stockton, you know, the impact on employment, the two times more likely. That seems like something very stark. Did that just surprise you and the researchers at all?
I feel it surprised the researchers. It didn't surprise me, and not because I'm super smart, but I just know poor people. Like I grew up poor, like so nothing. It all made sense to me. I was like, and I say it's like one of my staff members sent me a clip when I was on the Bill Maher show, and he was like, "You're gonna make people stop working." And I said, "No, honestly, I think people are gonna work more." And he just started laughing, and I was like, "No, that's what's gonna happen." And it's because, and I don't know if it's different over the seas, but in the States, part-time workers don't have paid time off. So even to interview for a job means taking money out your pocket to interview for something that's not a guaranteed, while your bills are guaranteed. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable, particularly with dependents, in taking that risk. And kind of and the $500 gave people agency, and that was super important. But also in SAD, we have to overemphasize that point, but we have a whole legacy and history in this country where we equate sort of financial means to effort and work ethic, and we also have all these racist things we have to disentangle about work and wealth. So we have to say, look, giving people money, people aren't going to stop working. Because we just have this unhealthy obsession, if you ask me, with work and production. The second thing we found are the health impacts. So what we found was that before receiving the guaranteed income, the folks in the treatment group who received the dollars and the folks in the control group who didn't receive the dollars, both were depressed according to the Kessler scale. Both had elevated levels of depression. After 1 year, we found those who received the guaranteed income had normal levels of depression, like weren't depressed, while those who didn't were even a little bit more depressed. And it's comparable literally to clinical trials of Prozac, which doesn't mean that like medicine isn't important, but it does mean that so many of the mental health issues we see, so much of the stress, the anxiety, and depression are caused by chemical imbalances for sure, but that may be triggered by the scarcity and the stress of not being able to pay for your basics. And that particularly in the midst of a public health crisis, it may be important to think about the guaranteed income in terms of a public health measure. Like this is a way to lower our healthcare costs. And this is a way to get healthier people. And what's crazy about this, I shouldn't use the word crazy, forgive me. What's interesting about this, Michael, is that people kept reporting, even before the data, they would always say, I feel like I could breathe. I feel like I can breathe. I feel like I can breathe. I feel like I can breathe. I'm a better parent because of $500. I'm a better partner because of $500. And as a government official or a former government official, and now working with government officials, I tell my colleagues all the time now, I said, listen, you guys, what do we want people to do? We want people to be parents, we want people to be partners, and we want people to be good neighbors. Guaranteed income allows people to do all those, like it allows people to do all the things we want them to do. Like we formed government for those things, and an income floor allows people to do that.
Yeah, and I remember Suki and colleagues when I was in Stockton recalling that the I Can Breathe thing. It was when they were kind of beginning to hear some of the initial feedback from participants, and it was striking that was unprompted, something that regularly came up from participants. I wonder if you could, like, are there any stories, like any individual particular stories that illustrate some of that best? I know I've heard you talk about Thomas and a few other people. I wonder if you could just share a couple of stories that perhaps illustrate the kind of data that you've shared with us.
Yeah, Thomas. I'm talking about Thomas Zane and then another young lady with kids. So Thomas, he was one of our storytelling recipients, so I know more about him. He taught me so much. Like in the first 2 months, he told the press, he said the $500 allowed me to interview. And I think I mentioned this earlier. And I was so confused by that. So I asked him, I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I have 2 kids. We live paycheck to paycheck. So there's a lot of jobs I'm qualified for, but I can't take the time off to do it because that means minus $200. And I have bills. I can't take that risk. It's irresponsible. But when he was able to do so, he got a full-time job, worked less hours, got better pay, better benefits. And then he talked about how he said, I feel so good because I'm able to buy my kids tutoring. They were struggling in school and I couldn't help because I was working. My wife couldn't help because she was working. We couldn't afford a tutor. But now I'm able to buy a tutor. My kid feels smart. My kid gets it. My kid's doing well. And then 6 months later, he says, because I've been home more, I've noticed things about my kids. Like I learned that one of my kids really loves science. So I've been able to take her to the aquarium. I've been able to take her to the beach. I've been able to do like literally basic. And as someone with an 18-month-old, I feel that. I'm like, oh my gosh. Like I have so much agency over my time that I'm able to spend time with my son. And I know my son, right? So that's Tomas. And I think he's just a great example of how folks are smart. And I want to underscore that because when we started, people were saying, well, after the 18 months, like you're saying people are for failure, what happened after the money runs out because it's a pilot? People aren't dumb. So what they did, they used the money to pay for one-time things or to position themselves to be in a better position when the money runs out, like in a better job. Hello, duh. Or even like saving it up. Some people saved it up to pay for a down payment on a better apartment where they can afford the rent, but they didn't have the capital to afford the down payment. Brilliant. People are so smart. That's the biggest takeaway. People are smart. Most people. A lot of the not smart people, unfortunately, are in politics, but that's a different story for a different day. And then there's another woman, Maggie, who was older, close to retirement. Her husband couldn't work. And she said the $500 was like a replacement for the work she lost for having to take time off to be a caregiver to her husband. And again, in the States, we don't really have, and Joe Biden's doing a better job with this in his recovery plan, but we don't really have a good caregiving infrastructure. And it's so stupid. Like if you go next door and take care of someone or their kids, you get paid. But if you do it like in your house, you don't get paid, even though it's literally the same work. It's stupid. But so she said the $500 honored her work as a caregiver, and she was able to like still be able to pay for some things and didn't feel stressed taking time off work because she knew she had that $500 as a supplement in some respects. And then people didn't like this. I love this. One lady talked about how she said, I'm able to say yes to my kids in the corner store instead of no. And I remember growing up, my mom would always say before we go into the store, don't go in here begging. Meaning don't come in here asking for things that aren't on this list. Like, we're not getting candy. We're not getting chips. No, no, no. And don't put me in a position to tell you no. Just don't ask. So I empathize with the kid who now is able to go to the store with mom and was able to get his chips. And
yeah, the list is longer now.
Like, what's wrong? Like, people, and I think that's part of it as well, because so much of the focus has been on like, people have been working, people are spending money good. But I like the fact that people are able to be people. People are able to buy birthday cakes. People are able to buy chips. People are able to get their nails done. People are able to take their kids to Disneyland. Like, we're not put on this earth just to work and to barely pay bills. That is so miserable. And I just refuse to demand that people live like that. Like, people should have their basics taken care of and then do all the other things like give life to the human experience.
And it's, I mean, I'm just like smiling, listening to some of these stories, because you're right, it's those stories that are so much more important about dignity and what it really means to be human, rather than these kind of stats about how much we work or and those kind of things. But I think listening to you tell those stories, that was built in, am I right, in terms of the demonstration? It's not a traditional experiment in the other way that some pilots are often designed. You're getting a lot of headlines, you're getting a lot of media coverage, but it's a relatively small study, but with a big story to tell, right? And it's really noticeable. You don't call it a pilot; you've called it a demonstration. Could you tell us a little bit about the thinking behind that? And is perhaps that's something for us to learn in the UK and around the world about how we go about telling these stories?
Well, we realized that, I mean, you guys see even our debate we have around gun control in healthcare in our country. Now, unfortunately, data doesn't drive our political decision making. Like, data does not drive U.S. political decision making. So we knew going on that it was important to have the research and the findings, but we knew there were other, like, there's like a larger scale RTC being done by Y Combinator that'll be out in 2 years. So we knew there were other studies that were happening at the same time ours were, but we knew that this is a political question, not a research one. Like, we're not applying for a patent, we're applying for policy. And we know that to do that, we had to change heart and minds and change the story. Because in America, the story is that if you work hard, you make money. If you don't work hard, you don't make money. In America, the narrative is that you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, regardless of the fact that you need money to buy boots and straps. Like, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have boots. Like, you just and you need money to buy boots, right? So we knew it was important for us to really lean in. And in America, we also have this like obsession with dignity being attached to work. And that may be true, but in reality, dignity is not actually attached to work in our country, because folks work in undignified conditions all the time, without the dignity of healthcare, without the dignity of paid time off, without the dignity of union organizing, without the dignity of fair wages. Like, what? Dignity. And so we knew we need to really emphasize that dignity is attached to humanity before it's attached to work. Right? Like, we're dignified, we have dignity inherent. Because what does that mean for folks who are differently able? they don't have dignity because they don't have traditional jobs. What does that mean for folks who do caregiving and domestic work for home? They don't have dignity because they don't have jobs. So we knew in our design that we weren't just, because data across the world tells us like this works, but we knew it was going to be an issue, a political question, a question of changing hearts and minds. And that's why we emphasize, in addition to the research, the storytelling to really give life to that. And that's why we started Marriage for Guaranteed Income, understanding that we need to get this going. Not just, it's going to have, unfortunately, we're going to have to hear this 100 more times. And then also COVID-19 has provided an opportunity to really highlight all the ways in which sort of the existing social arrangement just wasn't working and isn't right for the times of pandemic and disruption that we live in.
So you mentioned Mayors for a Guaranteed Income there. I'm going to bring in John and Tchiyiwe in a moment because I'm going to take liberty and take that extra 30 minutes that you've given us, Michael. Just while I was been pausing on bringing Tchiyiwe and John in. But you mentioned Mayors for a Guaranteed Income there. For those that don't know, I mean, this demonstration, demonstration of the stories, is spreading right across the United States with all of these demonstrations that are now taking place in all of these other cities. Could you give us a little bit of flavor of what's going on there and just like what is the catalyst for that, do you think? And then I'm going to bring in Tchiyiwe.
So when I first started the Guaranteed Income pilot, so many mayors in the United States were interested, but I mean, a lot of them are maybe not better leaders, but definitely better politicians than me. And they're like, well, I'm gonna let you go first. You get the bullets, you take the heat, and when it's safe, we might go ahead and join you. So we did it, and then what really did it in the States was kind of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter protest this summer. And people are like, how are those things related? And it's because, again, I mentioned Dr. King. Well, in 1967, when he wrote Where Do We Go From Here, that was also a time of over 200 protests in the States against sort of racism. And he looked out on that and saw guaranteed income as a solution to that issue and others as well, not the solution, but a solution. And then with COVID-19, we had folks who weren't working, not because they didn't want to work, because they couldn't work. We had folks who had to stay home for 2 weeks, didn't have paid time off. We had all these disruptions that all the mayors were like, we need to go in this, we have to meet the moment. We have to really think deep and go big and even be a little bit uncomfortable in terms of where we should go and what we should do. So I approached like 10 of the best mayors I knew, and I said, listen, we should do this. And they all were like, they actually were already doing some of this work in their cities with COVID, like giving people money because of COVID. So like, okay, let's do it. And that's how Mayors for Guaranteed Income was founded. So now we have 50 mayors across the country who are not just piloting, but also advocating. I see a lot of questions in the chat about how to move from pilots to policy, 1,000,000%. So we're also doing a lot of advocacy work. So we're also meeting with senators, meeting with the White House, talking about making the child tax credit, which is a guaranteed income President Biden proposed for families with children, permanent. And that's just the guaranteed income for parents with children as a start. And as I told them, I said, that's a great start because I know a lot of my peers, they want to have kids, they don't have money now to have kids. So if you gave them money, they could have kids, and then they can also qualify for the guaranteed income for children as well. So that's sort of how it started. And now we have mayors doing $1,000, 1,000 people, targeting different groups. LA took money from the policing budget, so we're going to invest it in some of the neighborhoods with the highest amounts of crime in the city. So it's exciting to see how the movement has just moved in 3 short years.
Yeah, I mean, every time I check your Twitter, it's like a new city is like popped up, and you're congratulating the mayor on the leadership that they're taking there. It's so exciting. So, I mean, it's really obvious that it's the kind of city level and the mayors who are really driving this energy. But go on.
I'm sorry. I'll shut up because I know there's a lot of wisdom on this panel. But the last thing I'll say is that I did Mayors for Guaranteed Income very particularly, that for some reason in the States, like mayors have none of the power, but we get all of the blame, but also all the attention. Like people really care about what the mayor does, what the mayor says, what the mayor is doing. And not just people, but other electeds respond to mayors differently because they're all elected from our voters. Like the Congress people, the senator, they're all elected, the governor, they're all elected from people in our city. So mayors have such a disproportionate influence. And I saw as mayor how when mayors spoke, we would get a response, like somebody would answer. And that's why I thought that I don't think basic income should be implemented at a city level. I think in the states, it needs to be federal, or if not federal, statewide, if not statewide at the county level. But in terms of the politicians with the juice, but also the savvy, who know how to tell stories, who know how to talk to press, mayors just were like the obvious pick.
Yeah. And we're kind of really seeing the similar energy here in the UK. It's like our devolved governments in like Wales and Scotland who are really interested in this, and our local authorities, who I suppose are your version of like counties, who are like expressing commitment to pilots. And there's the real energy for this campaign in the UK is being really driven by the UBI Lab Network, which is where Tchiyiwe comes from and representing this evening. So it's good to bring Tchiyiwe in. Tchiyiwe, you've got a kind of question, comments, keen to pick Michael's brains on really that role of elected representative. So welcome, Tchiyiwe. Do you want to come in and take over?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael. That's been very insightful. I don't know whether I should differentiate by saying Mayor Tubbs, and then that will make it easier for us. I think I want to latch on a little bit onto the question of representation at the local level, especially representatives. In a very similar way, I suppose, to the United States. Why do you think it's more local representatives that are so far leading the cause for UBI? And also in that same vein, what is being done in the United States to connect up the different elected representatives at all levels?
Yeah, no, so I think it's because being mayor is actually it's a ridiculous job. It's great, but it's kind of bizarre. So you hear from every single person who lost their job when you're like walking your dog. You hear from so you're confronted with the problems not on a piece of paper, but like flesh and blood, saying, I don't have money, my water's going to be like, and and if you're a human, that necessitates a response like, oh shit, we got to do something, right? So I think that's part of it, because we're not really shielded and guarded. We are front and center, and that's part of it. The second thing is, in addition to the Mayors for Guaranteed Income, the Economic Security Project has convened something called the Communities of Practice, which is kind of a convening of the community groups who are also doing kind of guaranteed income pilots. And then between Mayors for Guaranteed Income and the Communities of Practice, we do a lot of work with sort of the other electeds. So one of the other groups of elected officials doing work in the states, particularly in California, are the counties. So like, for example, this morning I was on the call with LA County about sort of thinking through a guaranteed income, which would be huge, because they're like the largest, I think they're like one of the largest government entities in the states, even larger than some states. So between Mayors for Guaranteed Income on the political side and the Communities of Practice, we also provide support for counties and state legislatures who've also reached out. Yeah.
Right. That's really interesting. I wonder what your thoughts are on this. So between the basic income conversation, so that's the other Michael sat next to, well, in this room, and ourselves at the UBI Lab Network, we're working with elected representatives from across all levels of government, and this is a cross-party working group of politicians. So we facilitate that sitting of them, and to talk about a universal basic income, but also to look at pathways potentially to achieving a universal basic income. So that's whether they are lords, mayors, local councillors, members of parliament, etc. I wonder whether there's anything similar in the United States that you could relate that to. It's cross-party and at all levels of government at all.
No, I think the closest thing, and it's very nascent, is sort of the Communities in Practice. But I don't know UK politics that well, but American politics are so polarized. I'm spending a lot of time. I'm gonna get me a couple Republican mayors before the end of the year. I'm just where we just have to create the environment where it's safe for them to do so, where they're not primary by someone from the extreme right. Because like the Donald Trumpification of politics has made it so that any Republican who says anything that's like normal, then a crazy QAnon supporter will primary them. And if it's a party primary, they'll win the majority of the Republican vote, even though that person probably wouldn't be as viable as said person with a general electorate. So no, not in that way. But in the Senate, so Economic Security Project has done a lot of work in the Senate because there's a couple senators during COVID who have been actually in favor of cash transfers. Like Mitt Romney, Josh McCraisman, Josh Crowley, all those folks, but nothing with the level of specificity and intentionality. And that's something we should definitely learn from. But I think our politics are so toxic that we're going to have to go at it talking to Democratic officials and Republican voters. So I think our strategy has to be, let's talk to Democratic, make this the Democrat Party line, but let's also talk to like the Republican voters so they eventually could push their elected to be where they are.
Right. Okay, thank you. Michael, your basic income conversation. Can I ask one more question?
Of course.
Yeah. So sort of separate to that, you've spoken about universal basic income as a racial justice issue, something that resonates with me personally. I do think that it is very much a racial justice issue. And recently there's been growing calls in the United Kingdom on reparations, especially after the Windrush scandal. So the Windrush scandal is where the Caribbean community that came to the UK between 1948 and 1971 from the Caribbean, they were guaranteed indefinite leave to remain here in the United Kingdom in 1971, but then thousands of their children who had traveled on their parents' passport could not prove that they had the right to live here in the United Kingdom. And they were caught up in what's traditionally called the hostile environment. Hostile environment is an immigration policy that was introduced here in the United Kingdom in 2012. And some have been threatened with deportation. Then in 2018, it was revealed that many had actually lost their jobs. They lost their homes and they were denied access to healthcare and benefits. Subsequent to that, there was a compensation scheme that was set up for the victims in 2019. For many, it was too late. Many had already been deported. Many had lost their homes. So in your thinking, how do proposals for universal basic income interact with calls for reparations in the United States and the similarly growing conversation here in the United Kingdom?
Man, you, yeah, well.
Sorry.
No, I'm laughing and hesitating because I should have done more work and research in sort of UK politics and I didn't. So I'm just hesitant to speak on a different context and different experience I just have no knowledge of. But and this might not even answer your question, but so if it doesn't cut me off and be like, no, this is the question. But I know one of the hardest things, particularly in the States, in this conversation about kind of universal basic income or guaranteed income has been sort of making sure that we don't leave out issues of race when we're talking about this. And I've been in so many debates and so many arguments, actually. For example, so in the States, one of the proposals is that we would gut the existing social safety net. So we would take away all the things that people need now, from housing vouchers to food vouchers, et cetera, would take that away and give everyone the same amount of money. And I don't view that as just, or actually even as a step forward. And I say that, and I tell people all the time, I say, because if I don't need $1,000 in food vouchers or $2,000 in housing vouchers, and you do, why does it make sense to take away what you need to give us both the same thing? And I don't need it. Like, so I'm actually in a better off position than you are, and that would disproportionately impact people of color and Black people, because disproportionately Black people and people of color, there aren't the majority of people who are poor in the United States, but they're disproportionately poor and in poverty and economically insecure. And that's, for me, is why I think Dr. King, the Black Panther Party, the National Welfare Organization, and others. And one of my good friends, Dorian Warren, he wrote a paper about sort of guaranteed income in Black Lives Matter, and how sort of, again, a guaranteed income is a part of, it's not the only solution, and it's not the same as reparations, but it's a huge first step. It can get us there. It can get us closer and more comfortable to the idea. So I say that to say I think a guaranteed income is, for me, an issue of racial equity. But in the United States, the issue isn't just in income disparities, it's in wealth disparities. So I think a guaranteed income helps with issues of income, but it doesn't help address sort of wealth extraction, sort of wealth disparity, and that there's other solutions that have to be on the table for that. But I think, politically speaking, a guaranteed income seems to be the most feasible. It seems to be like the thing that can happen right now. So I'm not sure that answered your question.
I think you have spoken to it.
Okay.
You have. So thank you. I'll pass you back to Michael.
Do you mind if I dive in, Mike? Is that okay? I'm talking to Michael Pugh now.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Go on, jump in, John.
This is like my perfect segue though. So, hey, Michael, really lovely to meet you, and thank you. This I think in a year and a little bit more of lockdown, this is the first time I've been in a Zoom meeting where people in the chat are saying they're crying watching. So, and I think it's in a good way, man. I think it's in a good way. But you, and we have our mutual friend Ariana Conrad. But folks, Michael Tubbs has his book coming out at the end of this year. I promise I'll post the link in the chat, because he will be too humble to do so. But it's so you need to read the full story. But Michael, you like this thing about you started talking about basic income, guaranteed income is the most feasible. Now that is like fascinating to me, because I think so I'm going to put this really straight. So I work, I'm a kind of communication strategist by background, kind of work with lots of different, and I happen to work with mainly with one particular political party, the Liberal Democrats here, but I'm also like, I work across and interested in several, so I'm not speaking from my party. But the thing I see is a lot of fear in politicians' eyes when basic income crops up on the radar, right? Like and it's fear of looking stupid, I think, or looking naive, or looking or saying something that and they're scared of being called out as unaffordable. But I think that's as like a symptom of like not. What do you think this is a scary thing to stand up for? And if someone's like, if you were talking to a politician who was running for election and thinking about putting guaranteed income right at the heart of their platform, what would you say to them?
I would say, look at Andrew Yang. Like, no one knew, and he's a friend, but no one knew who he was before he ran for president. No one knows any of his policy platform for president but basic income. Now he has over 1 million followers and is the front runner for mayor of like New York City. Like, think about that. Just from talking about guaranteed or basic income. But I'll also say, I think in this moment, we have to meet like, what's your solution to pandemics? What's your solution to the next earthquake, the next hurricane, the next disaster? And then the one after that, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. Like what's your solution to the next super virus? And then the one after, like, what are you gonna do? Because what's scary is a world where folks are repeatedly, as soon as they recover from one pandemic, they're in the midst of another. What's scary is a world where people have hundreds of billions of dollars and people have $0. Like that to me, that's very dystopian, and that's very scary. And that is, yeah.
Lovely, man. That's really powerful. Thank you. And I guess it kind of bridges me on a little bit to a sort of more specific part of this, which is so when I first came across your work on basic income, I was really struck by the language, like and like I say, communication. Like I spent a lot of I worked in advertising for some time. Forgive me, I apologize. But the way you framed it, the language of seed, like Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. You didn't sort of go out and say UBI or use technical language. And I'm interested that you're using the language of guaranteed income rather than basic income. Like, language seems to be really important in this, and like at that really specific level. And I'd love to understand, like, how you've kind of used language in like those specific words, and why you choose guaranteed income, why you chose seed, where that came from. Like, how do you make your decisions about how to speak about this thing at that really specific level?
Yeah, I just realized that the words we use mattered so much. So when we talked about sort of the UBI, for a lot of folks in Stockton, it sounded so like futuristic and robot-y, and so like so San Francisco, but not Stockton, right? It sounded like an outside thing. And then I knew that part of the trope we were going to be fighting was this idea that we would make people dependent versus empowering them. So I wanted it to be baked into in terms of like this the program. It's the economic empowerment demonstration, and how basic income is about economic empowerment. And that felt like very affirming. It felt like a word that people could really rally around. In terms of guaranteed income versus universal basic income, that was really a political consideration I made. And it was because in talking to mayors, whether they knew the difference or not, they would say, I'm for guaranteed income. I'm not for universal basic income. But I was like, okay. So then, but then I also realized that to get to universality, at least in this, like in the United States, I don't think we're gonna go to universal first. I think we will go to guaranteed. And I think kind of the COVID stimulus checks are illustrative of that. So that was part of that consideration. And also Dr. King called it a guaranteed income. And I think for me, a guaranteed income provides a lot of flexibility, in my opinion, in terms of, because if it's universal and basic, everyone has to get the same, which may or may not be a good thing, or may or may not be a bad thing. And I'm supportive of that. But in terms of guaranteed, then there are ways to tier it. So if someone needs a little bit more, they get a little bit more. And also just in terms of political considerations, I don't.
It's interesting. So you.
No, the last point I was going to make, I'm sorry, is that I'm not interested in guaranteed in this conversation of universal basic income or guaranteed income for me or my friends at Stanford. Like whether we get money or not, like if we never got money, I would not be upset. I would not. But I am acutely interested in those who are in poverty or one paycheck away from poverty. So I think for me, a guaranteed income is sort of me saying that universality is great, and I get the arguments for that. I get why that's a good thing. But if that doesn't happen, I'm not going to be protesting as long as the folks who actually need it demonstrably, and it's a different matter of life and death for them, get it. So super long answer. So forgive me for that.
No, man.
John, before you come back on that, I just want to acknowledge that it is 8 o'clock here in the UK. We're going past the hour mark. Michael's been very generous enough to say that he's going to stick around for a bit longer. There's so much interesting conversation. I feel like we're just beginning to get into some interesting stuff. So we're going to carry on for another 30 minutes. Apologies if people need to go. We've still got this recording. It's going to go live again tomorrow morning. So don't worry too much. But so yeah, we're going to carry on. So John, but you were going to come back to Michael on a couple of points there.
I'm hoping that'll be quite a popular decision. I think it probably will be. Yeah, Michael, I guess I'm. So I take apart some of those answers, and I thank you for giving quite a long answer, because I think this is actually very important. I think too often we can get stuck in some of the sort of, because you can sort of go one of two ways. You can go into a sort of adoption conversation and a sort of how do we build this conversation, or you can go into a policy design conversation and then exactly what level and exactly, and I feel like we need to choose that first conversation a little bit more, would be my sense. And it's interesting listening to you, like the explicit decision to say like, no, the frame we want to avoid is dependence. So we're going to confront that and put the idea of empowerment front and center. That's what I'm hearing you say. And then with guaranteed, it's like, no, the conversation that matters less is like the insistence on exactly this. and the conversation that matters more is the principle and the story and the idea of humanity. Like what the thing that really appeals to me most in, I think, in your work is like this idea that, and you're so like you speak from a really different place to where a lot of the political conversation in this country is at the moment, because you speak from a kind of from a different common sense. You speak from a common sense that's like, it's common sense that if people don't have anything, then they don't have dignity and they don't have agency. It's common sense that if you don't have a chance, then you don't try and take your chance. Like, whereas the default common sense here is I think at the moment is more of a kind of, if you give people something for nothing, then they won't try to earn anything. If you give, and it's really, so sorry, I'm talking too much now, but I'm just digesting what you just said to me and kind of going like, really fascinating, like confront, like let's use language consciously. Let's steer into like, how do we make sure that we talk about empowerment and we talk about, and we put that at the heart of this, and how do we make sure we concentrate on the essence that we want to build in a way that allows us to build it. And maybe if I have a question rather than just a reflection of your own genius back at you, then my I'm playing with you.
No, but I think to your point, I just want to get it done, right? And I think as long and for me, because I get in all these arguments with people, I'm like, well, be upset with me, but right now we're at nothing. Right now, zero. Right now, 0 people are receiving anything. And it's been that way for hundreds of years. So in the next 4 years, we may not get to everyone. But if we get to some people, that's a huge improvement over the status quo. And I think for me, that just comes from just knowing folks who don't have the luxury of some ideological high ground of being right, but actually need the pragmatism of progress and need like, okay, but today, like and always with always a vision for what needs to be done, but being very rooted in, okay, what can we get done right now? Because the problem is just exacerbating, the problem is just multiplying.
And my last one, and then I'll let Mike and Tchiyiwe come back in, but do you have a sense of what you see the steps as being? You sort of alluded to it a little bit, like the first step is this, the second step is this. Is there a plan somewhere? I haven't seen that, so maybe there's a document or something. But
not to oversimplify, but we gotta get 50 votes in the Senate and the signature of President Biden. So the plan is, what do we have to do to get 50 votes in the Senate and the signature of President Biden? And then one of the big pushes right now is just to make that child tax credit permanent, because again, it's a guaranteed payment to families with children every month. And we want to make that permanent because once people see that, oh wow, this actually helped these children and these parents, we hope to have a conversation about what about people who don't have children? What about people who aren't parents? But I've been impressed with, like, now we're at a point almost where people have to have an opinion. And to me, that's an important marker, because that means it's worthy of debate. Like, it's something that people have to be for or against and on record. And that's why I'm spending a lot of energy trying to figure out now, like, how do you make universal basic income or guaranteed income? Are you for or against it? Because I think once we get to that point, we're even closer to legislation, because everyone has the answer. I'm for it, I'm against it, much like kind of Medicare for all in the States, or much like the Green New Deal in the States. How people, whether they're for or against, they have to answer, which I think gives it credibility and makes it part of the conversation.
I'm just gonna, like, last reflection from me and then back to you guys, but the question I'm kind of now holding after talking to you, which is a little different and has moved me on, is a couple of things, like, and actually it comes off that, the biggest one comes off that last contribution, which is this thing of like, what are the conversations that are already happening now that we can use to open this up? Because you're going, child tax credit is a conversation that is live, and we're saying, how do we make it permanent? And I'm like, what do we have? So furlough, how do we lean into that furlough conversation and say, like, what if it was furlough for all? Or like, how do we kind of start from where we are with an idea of where we're going? So that, just to share, like, what I'm now holding, and I, like, you've really pushed my thinking, so thank you. I'm going to go back to Mike.
Sure. Thanks, John. I mean, I think you touched on it there a little bit there, Michael, about what the Biden administration are doing, and I wanted to get your view on it in a little bit more detail. I wondered if you felt as though, there's been some commentators in the US who have said, in effect, that the changes to the child tax credit is a basic income for children for a year, and you've said that you'd like to see that the next battle is to see that be made permanent. We've also seen, obviously, the stimulus checks, 3 of them now, most recent $1,400, and beginning to see some people talking about trying to make that more regular, whether that's monthly or at least have more of them. Do you think you've talked there about progress and going from zero to something? Like, do you feel like the actions of this administration and its future talk about infrastructure, that is going in the right direction, and it is moving us closer to a basic income? And do you think it's been like, do you think politicians like Democratic senators who are voting for this, do you think that they're aware of that they are moving that conversation along?
No, well, I'm gonna answer this. I also see some things in the chat, and I think to the point, we live in actually a real world that is beyond sort of Zoom discussions. Meaning that there's forces for, forces against, forces like there's that you don't just get to snap your fingers and be like, we're gonna do it this way, or else it would have been done. Like, so I think, and I get it. It's messy, but it's just the reality of the world we live in, and we have to, again, it's a luxury to be frustrated with sort of, or it's a luxury to insist on purity versus kind of practicality and progress. That's like such a luxury to be like, because if you need it, how it gets is not that important as long as I get it. But to your question, I think that, yeah, we're having a conversation now where before giving cash to people in the United States was seen as antithetical to what it meant to be American. Now we're at a conversation where it's not about whether we can give cash, it's about how much cash and to who. To some people, that's not progress. To me, that's huge progress, because now we're in a conversation where we can talk about these other things that are giving cash to people. But we can't talk about those things if we can't even get to consensus that it's okay to give cash to people, right? And I think in the same way with the childhood tax credit, now we're in the conversation where we're saying, hey, it's okay to give cash to people with children just for having children. It's okay to make it monthly and make it regular. That's huge, because right now in the United States, there's not anything that's given to people that's monthly, that's regular, and that's cash. So you don't have to do anything. Or you don't, there's not forms you have to, like that's huge progress. And that's we could build upon. So we have a system by which we can give everyone money for being American, for being a citizen, for being a human. But unfortunately, things have to be scaffolded. I don't care what anyone tells you. I don't care what anyone tweets. I don't care what goes on a shirt or on a hat. Nothing that's a political question is going to happen in one fell swoop. It's going to be iterative. It's going to take narrative work. It's going to take, and I think if we really want to be effective, we have to be smart and disciplined and strategic, right? Like, because we have to move kind of public opinion before we even move to policy. And that's why we spend so much time on storytelling.
Yeah, I think there's, just to kind of translate that into a UK context, obviously our version of the stimulus checks, albeit different, has been the furlough scheme. I don't know if you've kind of heard of this, of where the government have backed people's wages throughout the pandemic. And I suppose it's that slight culture shift of where that was unimaginable, like not even that long ago, like a year ago, if the government was to do it. And it's that kind of movement of like, can we accept that actually giving out money so-called for free is becoming more and more accepted. And I suppose what we're hearing from you tonight is that if it, again, in a UK context, we're beginning to hear this more about the question about those two terms. Is it UBI or is it a minimum income guarantee? We're hearing more about this phrase of a living income as well. And kind of what we're hearing is that it's almost like it's not one or the other. It's just like what's going to get us there quickest, and what's going to be stepping stones in order to reach there. And you said about being strategic and smart politically. Presumably, like, let us into your mind a little bit about what that strategy is of how we go from Stockton, how we go from 40 cities, how we go to, you know, where is next? Is it the city, state level or county level, or is it federal level? And presumably, like in 18 months, 2 years, we're going to see a whole wave of cities who are coming out with their own stories and their own, you know, their own pilot results. Like, what's it? You know, is that kind of the strategy that is going to be lots of waves of these stories now hitting American airwaves?
Yeah, I think it's a function of stories, but it's also a function of getting the right people. So a lot of these mayors, for example, Mayor Eric Garcetti in LA was Joe Biden's national co-chair of his campaign. So Garcetti gets listened to by the White House in a way that the former mayor of Stockton doesn't, right? So having him as a champion and saying this is what we did in LA gives us more influence with the federal government. Having folks like Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta, who was also almost a vice presidential pick, who was the other co-chair for his campaign, having a guaranteed income pilot. So when President Biden calls them and asks what's going on, what are you working on? It's like, oh, it's not this like young mayor in Stockton, it's the mayor of Atlanta. It's the mayor of Los Angeles. It's these mayors of these metropolises that helped you get elected that are saying, listen, this is what we need to do. So I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is doing more to kind of get this country ready in terms of narrative. That in the United States, the reason why we don't have universal health care, for example, is the same reason why we don't have a universal basic income. And it's racism. It's that we have folks in our country who think that anything that helps people of color, even if it helps white people too, is inherently socialist, is inherently anti-American, and is against their self-interest, even though it's not. But it is against kind of this racial hierarchy that's been established in the country. So part of the work we have to do is also change that, do that hard work and that narrative work around sort of, we all do better when we all do better. that guaranteed income or universal basic income is for you and me. Like, it's a good thing. Like, this is something it's part of our inheritance for being in this place. Because we create so much wealth, we generate so much wealth that we all should benefit in some way from that. If it's universal, or even if it's guaranteed, even if we can't get to universality, and then people shouldn't have to struggle to live when we have so much. Let's provide a floor so that everyone has at least a little bit of something, like either one of those. But that's going to take some narrative work. And then I know that in the state of California, because I'm a special advisor to the governor, we've had conversations about sort of what can the state government do to at least support the work of the cities and counties. So I think we'll see more governors coming out. And I think the more we have institutional leaders talk about, hey, we need to look at this. And institutional leaders, though, who are in elected office. And that's important because I think part of the reason why data doesn't drive decision-making politically in the States is because, like, if the data is unpopular or if the solution is unpopular, the folks who produce the data don't suffer consequences from that because they're not elected. But for something like a guaranteed income or any other policy, because it is a political question, folks are looking for cues like, will voters accept this? Will I still be able to have my job to do the other things I care about and still advocate for this? And I think that's why having more elected leaders say this is the way to go, at least in the American political context, is kind of the quickest way to get to a yes.
Yeah. So you think some politicians and other mayors, you know, they're kind of conscious, you know, perhaps looking at people like Andrew Yang and what happens in the race in New York, just to see that can I win on this? Basically, I was going to ask. We had some questions beforehand that people submitted, and about what are some of the challenges that you still hear when you're speaking to other mayors, trying to persuade them to do this, and yeah, like what do they say? Like what's their barrier? Obviously, now that you were their guinea pig, you've gone and done it now. You've proven that it works. Like what's kind of their barrier to it?
It's just like this. It's weird. It's this deep. It's these deeply held notions that may or may not be true about work, and
Mm.
we've been really socialized in this country to think that in the States, excuse me, to think that you have to work. Like no one should not work. But then we don't have an inclusive definition of work that includes kind of unpaid work that women do. That doesn't include the contributions of differently abled people. Doesn't include sort of even the work of community, like being a coach, like even the work of community. Like we don't include that. We think like needs to be like in a manufacturing plant, which is good for folks who can do that, but everyone can't do that and everyone doesn't want to do that. So it's just that, like, well, people need to work, or even some mayors I'm talking to now, they're like, I'm only for basic income for these people, for homeless people, and it's like, okay. So okay, so I think that's just it. It's really contending with these notions of kind of what really it's really an argument about what do human beings deserve for nothing else but being human. Like, what are the basic things we want to give to all human beings? That's literally the question.
And one, John, you need to head off.
So thank you, John. As I go, I'm sorry, I do have to go, but I just there's local election campaigns going on here right now, Mike. We've got elections on May the 6th, so a lot of us are in other meetings and stuff as well. So I apologise for dropping off. I just wanted to shout out a comment that someone's just made in the chat, which is let's organise mayors for a guaranteed income at the international level. So if you want to open up your website and we can start to put you some names in there, then we are with you, my friend.
Okay, let me talk to the team who actually does the work to see if they're ready. But no, we're definitely. I'll follow you offline.
They're ready. Thank you so much. I'm going to duck.
Thanks, John. That's going to be one
of our.
Can I
jump onto that? Is it right if I jump onto that?
Yeah. I've got one other question I want to come back on, but go on, jump on it, Tchiyiwe.
So the UBI Lab Network, alongside some other partners, such as the Basic Income Conversation at present, in light of the elections, as mentioned by John, we were getting mayoral candidates, councillor candidates to pledge to back a UBI at present. And if looking back a few years ago, you did not back Andrew Yang. I'm wondering how that played into Andrew Yang's candidacy at the time anyway, but I'm wondering how that played into where your politics are today. You talked about him as a friend, and he's standing for mayoral candidate for the United States, for New York rather, which is a very strategic city across the world. Where are you now? And what's the bearing of that kind of support?
Yeah. No, so I appreciate the question. In terms of why I didn't support Andrew Yang in the presidential campaign, was a couple reasons. I think that there were other people that were more qualified to be president of the United States than Andrew Yang, and I thought obviously so. And I love Andrew, but that's just my opinion. Number two, I didn't support his UBI proposal at the time, and I shared that with him and his staff in terms of gutting the existing social safety net. I just didn't think that was the way to go. But since then, my staff has worked with his staff, and if you look at his proposal, his guaranteed income proposal as mayor, it's radically different than the one he ran for president on. It speaks to sort of a focus on poverty eradication, on interacting with existing benefits, etc. But now, because of my role of mayors for guaranteed income, I have to pledge fealty to the idea versus the candidate. So my board has made it so I could be helpful. So for example, I did a town hall with Andrew a couple of weeks ago before a fundraising deadline. But I can't formally endorse, because no matter who's the mayor of New York, we want to make sure guaranteed income is part of their platform, and we don't want them to have ill feelings towards the organization because one of the face of the organization endorsed one of their candidates. So our policy as of now is that we're open to anybody who's running for mayor who's interested in guaranteed income, we're open to have a conversation to make guaranteed income part of the race. We stand ready to support after the election. And we'll do what we can to be helpful during, but can't make any formal positions, because then if it's not the person we think, then that's one city who probably won't join Marriage for Guaranteed Income.
Yeah, pretty big one as well. So you mentioned there like interaction with the current benefit system, and kind of that potentially being a barrier in various localities is often the thing that we get when speaking to politicians here is that, look, we'd love to do an experiment, a pilot demonstration, but by giving people money, that's going to like mess around with their existing welfare payments, and it's going to move them in and out of various tax brackets. And it's a kind of practical question that politicians ask. We're faced with that issue in Scotland, where there's 4 local authorities, there's pilots designed and ready to go, but without the cooperation of the equivalent of the federal government here, the Conservatives who are in power, them not cooperating means that there's a reluctance there on regions and cities to piloting it, and that's kind of probably one of the biggest barriers that we face to doing something similar to Stockton. I wondered if
but the Stockton pilot we did while Donald Trump was president.
Yeah, and I wondered how did you get around that? And I know there was obviously private investment that and we don't have as much of a culture of that here for good or for bad. But like, did you know, were you able to secure waivers with the city level, and how did it interact basically? So, and any advice for people designing a pilot here that might be able to get around some of those questions, because it's a big one?
Yeah, what we did was we got waivers for what we could get waivers from. But even, for example, in Stockton, our county government was a lot more conservative, clearly, than, well, I think most people probably are, than I was. So we got waivers where we could get them. And then we were able to classify the $500 as a gift versus income, which kind of avoids some triggering of other benefits. But then we also did benefits counseling. So for every single person who was selected, they sat down with a benefits counselor just to go over sort of, if they were on benefits, the benefits they have, and how, even if it was a slight risk, how being part of the pilot would make it, but like might do something because we weren't able to get these waivers. And doing so allowed people the opportunity to choose. And some people decided not to be part of the study. And some people, it's like, I think 20, 30 people total that maybe were on benefits during the pilot. And then some people decided, you know what, I'd rather take this $500. So, but we did, I think the key for those designing is just to get everything secured that you can, but don't let not having everything stop you, because what you can do, you can still do a pilot. And maybe in this instance, it doesn't go to people who are on benefits, but it goes to like, I think it's still important to do the pilot, and don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And you just have to do something, right? And if you want to go forward and include as many people as possible, then just make sure there's benefits counseling. Make sure you have folks who are experts, who are able to sit down with people and just let them know how this can interact with existing benefits. And then also trust people to make the best decision for themselves and their families. Because again, some people said, you know what, thank you for this information, I'm not going to move forward. We have to find other people. And then some people said, oh, that's fine, I appreciate the information, but we still want to move forward.
Yeah, that's really helpful, practical insight there. And as what you said earlier, you know, people aren't dumb. Like, if you put all the information in front of them, they're going to probably make the right decision more often than not. I'm conscious of time. It's 27 past. I'm sorry, Tchiyiwe, we're gonna wrap up. I'm so grateful for lots of your time this evening, Michael. I understand that you're going to be doing something with the UBI Lab Network later on in the spring. I know you've already agreed to kind of speak to some. Tchiyiwe mentioned earlier the kind of cross-party group of politicians. I think that they need to really hear you talk about this kind of more directly to them. So I know you've agreed to come and speak to some of those. So there's already a kind of connection there. But I suppose just if you could finish up by just sharing like how you view this as a kind of global movement, and how you'd like to see the kind of relationship between us and you develop between the UK and the US.
This has been so incredibly inspiring, thought-provoking, motivating, And I think part of it just come from being a super local elected official, being just laser focused on Stockton. And then it was a great reminder of how contexts are different, but foundationally, a lot of the issues are the same. It's hyper-capitalism, it's racism, it's sort of not really affording everyone the benefits of basic dignity, and the benefits of the benefit of the doubt that comes with that realization that, oh, I think you're as smart as me, so you probably deserve this, or I think you're like me. Like, so this has been super thought-provoking, and I am heartened and excited. I am so moved by the work of the UBI Lab Network and just that level of intentionality and kind of bipartisanship, because I don't think we have that maybe on criminal justice. There's some organizations in the States that do that good work on criminal justice between the left and right. I think that's why you saw at least some progress, even under President Trump, on criminal justice reform. So that's something to think about, although I'm reluctant to give myself more work because I'm like tired, but it's super interesting and necessary. And yeah, I am as helpful as I can be. I am down to help. I'm down to talk to my other elected officials and definitely want to be thinking about sort of what we can do. Yeah, and maybe part of it's another conversation, like a strategy conversation or a doc around how do we make universal basic income or guaranteed income similar to what we've seen with climate and like the Paris Accords, and how all these, because I remember as mayor, one of the things we did interact with other cities on was on climate stuff. Like that, it was that, and for some reason that seemed like, oh yeah, climate, you got to work with the world. So in the same way, if we could do that with this issue, that would be incredibly powerful.
That would be, and obviously there's COP26 coming up, hosted in Glasgow, and there's, I think, everyone's attention is going to be thinking about climate and obviously how this intersects with that, and that might be something really interesting to pick up.
But I think, and I'll shut up after this, I actually have to go. But I think what's powerful is that COVID-19 and just being in California with the wildfires and earthquakes really taught me that a basic income is really about pandemic response. It really is about climate change, because you have all these disruptions that happen and folks can't work, folks can't get to jobs, folks are displaced. And it's actually very expensive for governments to come up with a new solution to things that we know are going to happen every single year. And this guaranteed income represents, I think, like economic resilience. And that's what it takes to persist. And that's why the poorest parts of the world and poorest parts of every country are the most impacted by climate change, because of like not having the money to do all the things necessary to provide for themselves and their families. So, all right, I'm gonna get in trouble. Let me go.
Yeah, you get off. Thank you so much, Michael. We'll be in touch. We'll follow up after this. Tchiyiwe, thank you so much for your contributions tonight. It's so insightful as always. If people have been inspired by this evening's conversation, we're encouraging people to start their own basic income conversations. We know that can be tricky, and we've designed a toolkit for you to do that. I'm putting a link into the chat. But I know we've taken so much time of everybody's time this evening, and we've gone like way over time than we usually do. For people that come to these events, we usually start on time and finish on time. We've abused that tonight on such a big evening with everybody going out this evening. So we're going to get, there's so much in the chat. We're going to download this, get this transcribed somehow, obviously record everything that Michael said and get this out to everyone. So you'll have signed up to get emails in order to come to this event tonight. So we're going to follow up with all the information from this evening. So thank you, everyone. Again, Susan, yes, the toolkit tutorial is happening. We can get some more information about that. Tchiyiwe, were you trying to say the last words there?
Oh, I was just going to say thank you so much for having the UBI Lab Network. And also, I think, and you just need to clarify that the work with the cross-party parliamentary and local government group is being done in partnership with Basic Income Conversation. I think that got lost in the conversation. So just to be clear on that, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so much got lost in there, but absolutely, our organisation's working in partnership together. It's been super fun tonight and as we move forward. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Take care, enjoy the unlocking as we go, and we'll see you soon.